This is Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello and welcome to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Paresa Noble. Paresa, welcome back from maternity leave.
Thank you so much. I am excited to be back. It has been a long while.
It has, 2 months, I think, since, or 6 weeks? I can't remember how long you were gone. It seems like longer, but...
Yeah, it was about like 6-7 weeks. So definitely some time. The little one's about to be 2 months old here, and it's just flying by. I can't believe it. Time flies.
Well, congratulations on being a mother for the second time.
Thank
It's exciting.
you. Thank you. Yes, it's been good. Going from 1 to 2, I was definitely nervous, but it is not as hard as I thought it would be. So that's good.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And now your son has a playmate now, which will be good. That'll come in handy as they get older.
Right. They can keep each other occupied. That's what I hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great to have you back. It was, I was telling Kyler, I think last week or the week before in our episodes that it was very difficult to not have a co-host or not have someone with you during these podcasts. So it's good to have you back.
Yeah, good. I'm happy to be back. I'm sure it's definitely easy to bounce around ideas when there's someone else there to talk it through. So definitely happy to be back. I missed the show. I missed you. I missed the audience. So I'm excited to jump back into it.
Yeah, and me too. And while you were out, or right as you were coming back, I suppose it was, there was the Colonial Pipeline here in the United States had a cybersecurity breach, and obviously a lot of organizations that are going through digital transformations or just managing an IT function in general are concerned about cybersecurity, and it's becoming an increasing concern for a lot of organizations. So maybe we could start there and talk a little bit about that hack and what it means to other organizations throughout the world.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just can't even believe that this happened. It's definitely, first we started with the SolarWinds hack, and then now this happens, and just these hacks on such a large scale, it puts it into perspective what we're up against when it comes to cyber threats and cybersecurity. But I mean, I was looking into it, and the Colonial Pipeline is huge. I mean, I read somewhere that it passes through 3 million barrels of fuel a day. 3 million a day. And it goes from Houston to New York. So it gives almost half of the fuel supply to the East Coast. So for that to go offline is no small, it's a big deal. I guess I could just put it like that. It's a very big deal. And I don't know if you looked into who is behind the cyber attack, but they call themselves Dark Side. Did you read that?
No, I didn't see this part of it. No.
Yeah, they call themselves Dark Side, which I'm like, that's from Star Wars, right?
Yeah, you'd assume that's where they got it.
Yeah, so I'm just envisioning like Darth Vader sitting behind a computer screen just trying to hack everybody. But I don't know, scary thought nonetheless. And it sounds like it was a ransomware attack. So I thought, you're probably aware of the kind of different types of cyber attacks that can happen, and maybe we can dive into what is ransomware for those that might not know. What is it?
Yeah, so it's typically what'll happen is you'll have an outside party who takes over your systems, and a lot of times it could be a web domain, it could be your actual systems, and they lock you out, and basically you can't get back in because they've taken complete control of those systems. And what they want is they want you to pay them money in exchange for releasing the system or the domain back to you. And so it's that's where the term comes from. Wow.
Well, I know that they're back online now, and I'm curious, like, how much money did they pay this Darth Vader guy or a group? Who knows? But it's just crazy to think that is just one of the many ways that these hackers can get into your systems and kind of put a halt on your operations. And when it's operations that are to this scale, it's definitely frightening. I know they closed it down. I also read they closed it down because they were worried that the ransomware would like spread to the system. So I didn't know that would happen. That is even able to happen. So do they like plant it somewhere and then it could just completely take over the whole system if you don't stop it?
That's what I've heard or read. I'm not familiar with that myself, but I think there is software that is used in the whole attempt to take over the systems, and I'm not sure the nuances of how it works. I'm not sure, that many people do, which is part of the
Yeah,
problem.
that is
Um,
my problem. Makes
yeah,
me want to take a cybersecurity class, or even just, I don't know. Cybersecurity is probably a hot career to be in because
yeah, I would think so. Just with COVID, I think Daryl Crockett from our team, when we had her on talking about the SolarWinds breach several weeks ago, I think it was episode 1 or 2. She was on one of our first episodes of this podcast. She was talking about how common it's become and how these hackers are escalating really since COVID. And part of that's because there's more cybersecurity exposure and risk because people are working remotely still, and there's just more opportunity. More unemployed people, people with too much time on their hands, people that find ways to make money. And this is one way to make money, I suppose, is to go hack someone's system and take it over and demand money in exchange for it. So, were these particular was this particular group based in the U.S. where this pipeline is, or was this an outside country?
I think it was outside the country, but I can't speak for sure. I feel like I heard that on the news, but I almost am speculating. So I'm not sure 100%, but I know that whoever they are, they know what they're doing, and it's all of these hackers. I mean, anybody who's trying to do it, it's become such an intricate process that they can almost infiltrate what seems like any organization if they really wanted to. I don't know. So it sparks the question in my mind of, obviously 2020 was a huge catalyst in how quickly we adapted to new technologies when everybody started working from home and started doing these virtual conferences, virtual meetings, and, did the cybersecurity excel at the same rate as, the cyber threat, or as at the same rate as us adapting to this new technological world. It feels
Right.
like it's not keeping up with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true, and it's a technological gap, as far as not keeping up with tightening up your systems and the security behind it. But then there's also the human and behavioral part of it too. As far as just making sure your team is aware of these sorts of threats and phishing scams and things like that, things of that nature. So it's both technological and human or change management related for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was speaking to somebody I know about what their company is doing in kind of the lieu of all the cyber threats in the world. And one thing that their IT team has started doing is sending out, practice phishing emails to their whole team so that their team can kind of be trained and just become more cognizant of, what is a phishing email like how can you tell the difference? So, take that one to the bank. If you are in IT, it's a good idea to start training the human side as well as tightening up your systems.
Yeah, and not just educating them, but also testing them and seeing where the exposures are, so that if someone's gonna have a lapse or make a mistake, hopefully it's done with your own team testing or faking a scam or a security breach. So that's what a lot of organizations are doing. In fact, that's something we're starting to do as an organization too, just to ensure that we, as we grow, we have more people throughout the world. It becomes more of a risk for us and really any organization that has our scale and breadth, or even larger for sure.
Right. Right. And that kind of takes me to my next question is what would you, I mean, you're kind of in the IT space. What would you say to leaders, both in the public and private sector, as we kind of enter this new world of crime that is all happening online? What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, I'd say you want to make sure you have pretty clear cybersecurity systems and processes in place, especially if you're going through a transformation and you're moving all your data from one system to another. I mean, there's risk there as far as sensitive data, financial data, customer data, product data, all that stuff. You're sort of digging that up and moving it to new systems. That's always a risk. And if you're moving it to the cloud, you want to make sure you understand who your hosting provider is and what those security protocols and processes are, and make sure you're comfortable with that. And if you're still running, say on-premise systems or systems that you're managing within your four walls, and you have people outside the physical office that are accessing it, or even if they're within the office, you just want to make sure that you account for the fact that there's risk in each of those scenarios, and just building that competency and that workflow into a transformation plan is super important.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I know you just recently had a conversation with Wayne about operating models. Maybe it's time to start incorporating cybersecurity into the operating model that you're running off of.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is absolutely true. And that sort of segues into this show and this episode and what we're going to cover today. We started while you were out on maternity leave. We started live streaming Q&A interviews on LinkedIn and YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. And so if you go to my profile on LinkedIn, or connect with me, follow me on LinkedIn and or YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, you'll see this live stream every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern time. We've been live streaming these Q&As, and we bring on a different guest every week. And last week we had Stuart Robb on, and we talked about digital transformation best practices in general, sort of what are the best digital transformation strategies and tactics. And then we had Wayne Holtham from our Asia Pacific office in Brisbane, Australia. I did a live stream with him, a Q&A, talking about operating models, which I used to think operating models were the same as business process improvement, but it's not. But if you're familiar with the term business process improvement or reengineering, it's somewhat similar to that. It's probably the thing you might be able to relate it to the most. So had a great conversation with him, really interesting. I mean, he's a smart guy, and his brain goes a million different directions. And so the interview was super, super interesting. We had really good engagement from the audience. We had several hundred people watching it live and contributing questions as we were talking. So really good segment. We're actually going to share that here in today's episode. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll cut to that clip and show you that interview with Wayne, which is super interesting. So if you're going through a transformation, thinking about business processes and your future state operating model and how your organization and your operations need to look in the future, this is really a really helpful interview. So we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we will have Wayne Holtham on the show. So you're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology-agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Paresa and Eric. We go live every Wednesday morning U.S. time on YouTube and your preferred platform of choice, or your preferred podcast platform of choice, I should say. If you listen on Google or Spotify, Apple Music, Apple Podcast, any of those, you can find us there every Wednesday. So check us out and subscribe if you haven't already. And please share this podcast with your colleagues and friends. We'd love to get the word out, as we are still a relatively young and new podcast. So we'd love to get more people to listen in on this content. So we're going to cut over to an interview now, as I mentioned before the break, with Wayne Holtham. He is the Vice President of our Asia Pacific office. And not only does he lead up our Asia Pacific presence and our team in that region, but he's a very smart guy, like a lot of our team is. And he has a lot to talk about as it relates to operating models in this particular segment. And so we're going to talk with Wayne. I start off the segment in the first 20 or 30 minutes just asking him a bunch of questions on my own, and then suddenly the avalanche of questions started pouring in from the audience. So it's a really good conversation. I actually really enjoyed it. It's one of the best ones I think I've done in several months, I'd say, just in terms of the discussion and where it went. So this is going to be particularly important for those of you that are going through transformations and struggling with the question of how do we define our future state? You know, what do we want to be when we grow up, and how do we translate that into our transformation? A lot of companies struggle with that. A lot of organizations struggle. So that was the purpose of the conversation. So I'm going to cut it over to Wayne, and we will take the conversation from there. So Wayne, thanks for joining the show today.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So actually, while we're getting set up here, I'm actually going to make sure I'm live on all the streams here. So we'll maybe while we're getting started here, maybe just give us a little bit of background of some of your background and kind of how you came up in the world of digital and business transformation, and ultimately what we'll talk about here in a minute, which is business operating models and business process type stuff. But maybe just give us a quick overview in the meantime.
Okay, Eric. Yeah, I've been around, I suppose, for the last 30, 40 years in functional as well as, so in the days before we had computers. And since then got to the point probably about 15 years ago into digital transformation, when it really got into the point where, the basis of cloud was taking off. We had ERP platforms becoming the norm for major organizations. So working in the delivery of those major platforms, and digital transformation has probably taken off a lot more, because where we had an on-premise type instance in the past, now we have a lot more modules that we actually like to work together, and that just makes everything a bit more complex. So that's, I've sort of grown into that space, and from a delivery as well as a functional role. So you get to see both sides of what happens when it comes to operating a platform.
Great. So you've been doing this a while, and you've seen a lot of different a lot of different situations and types of transformations through the years, I suspect.
Yeah, and with a lot of different industries, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be mining, whether it be utilities, whether it be retail, everybody has a different sort of need, and that's why our topic today will be really good, because it sort of highlights that if you put some thinking in at the start, you can actually keep that secret sauce that got your business to where it needs to be, or where it started to actually be an advantage for you.
Yeah, great. Well, good. Well, before I dive into the questions here, I just want to welcome our audience too. We're live streaming right now on Crowdcast, where many of you are watching. I know we've got several people watching so far on LinkedIn, as well as YouTube and Facebook. So we're streaming on a few different platforms here. And the whole idea of this weekly Friday, or in your case, Wayne, or others in Asia Pacific, I guess it's Saturday already, but this Friday/Saturday standing time that we have for these live streams is really to record our transformation ground control primary interviews in a live setting. So we want to get more audience participation, and you're actually getting sort of behind the scenes of the podcast production here, because you get to be part of the show, and then we'll kind of wrap this up and put it through production and polish it up and all that good stuff, and put it out here in a couple of weeks as one of our episodes of Transformation Ground Control. So I appreciate the audience being here today. Encourage you to jump in anytime, add a question in the chat. If you're on LinkedIn, feel free to include a chat there, or on YouTube or Crowdcast, even Facebook. I'm watching all the platforms here. So as Wayne is answering my starting point questions, I'll keep an eye to see what questions you all might have. So to start, Wayne, maybe just the topic today is business operating model. Maybe just help us unpack what is that? What exactly is an operating model, and how does it fit into a digital transformation?
Well, it's interesting. Operating model, there's a number of different levels of operating models. So if I'm a major corporate organization, I'm looking at whether I'm decentralized, I'm centralized, and your normal consulting firms will come in and give you some advice on how you should structure organization, whether it be globally or whether it be within a particular region. But the operating model we're talking about today is about how we actually how we operate our technology. So we buy in a traditional ERP, we'll have the basics of ERP, but then we're actually looking for different modules. And so that helps us drive what our business operating model should look like, and then how we can leverage the technology to make that work for us. And so that's probably the different levels that we talk about with operating. And then obviously that leads into a number of different impacts to the business when it comes to how we operate. So are all our processes right? Are we doing things in a consistent way? Are there certain impacts that happen to us, like we might need investment to do a lot of projects, but we don't actually plan for that investment. So let's put in an operating model that supports that. So these are the sort of things to consider.
Okay. So if I hear you right, it sounds like an operating model is sort of like business process management or business process improvement. How does it or doesn't it relate to process management or process improvement? How does it all tie together?
Well, it influences it, and that's the key thing. So it's sort of, if you've got the overarching, I suppose, platform of the operating model, then the processes that come under that actually is what drives you as such. So if I'm doing, like I say, investment planning, then I want to be able to have a few processes that inform me where I should invest or how I should invest, what I should invest. And so that drives some of those processes of how do I get that information. So I need to be able to get, it's almost like a circular process. So I'm going to invest here. How do I invest? How do I deliver? How do I know I've delivered that on time? And so that's the sort of operating model that we talk about when we talk about that capital investment project type thing.
Gotcha. Okay. And when we think about the operating model and business processes in general, how does it fit into an overall transformation? You talked about end-to-end processes and how technology can help you define that future state operating model, but how does it all tie together? Or how does it, as far as sequencing and timing and all that stuff, how do you integrate this into your digital transformation?
Well, the operating model is one of those things you should think about at the beginning, because what it will do is actually say, well, what is the architecture we're actually going to have, the functional architecture of the modules. So for our digital transformation, we're going to have a grouping of modules that actually that we'll buy or we'll actually look to actually implement. And so that then those modules will then need to be defined on how we're going to have processes that support those modules or leverage those modules. And so the first stage is usually identify the operating model, then look at your architecture. So what's your bill of materials? What's your makeup of your platform going to look like? And then obviously the processes that actually drive and leverage that. And so that's where process improvement comes in, because often organizations work in the silo. So they'll work within their particular disciplines. What this is trying to drive is that they leverage off each other. So if I'm finance, I'm a supporter of getting better outcomes. So planning my investment, planning those sorts of things. Whereas in the past, finance was more just a transactional. So it helps them become that piece of the organization that manages efficiency across the organization, which is a big process as such.
Right. So it sounds like from what you're describing that this whole concept of operating model is sort of a centerpiece for any sort of transformation, whether it's a digital transformation or even just a general business transformation, where it's sort of driven by your operating model if you do it right, or if you do it the way that you're suggesting, and that sort of leads to other things. You figure out the architecture, as you mentioned, what architecture is best going to support that operating model, what technology, how does that affect the organization, the change management or the change impact, performance measures. It's sort of touching all those things, isn't it?
Oh, exactly right. And it's interesting when you actually deliver one of these programs, and I'm 2/3 the way through working with an organization to deliver a program, and I didn't come in at the start, so they didn't have an operating model. And so their selection was, we're going to get a whole heap of technology, we're going to make it like we had before. And now they've actually got this technology in, they're realizing the gap in what they've done is because the operating model doesn't support all of this other functionality. And so they're actually putting themselves backwards, because they still have the problem of not being able to manage their capital investment. They still have the problem where people do things differently. So there's nothing that actually guides or sits umbrellas the digital technology that they've purchased. So they've just got a whole heap of technology that'll fix it, and it doesn't, because it doesn't bring it together. There's nothing holding the processes or the actual architects, they can't even get out of design. So it's a real, you can see the challenge of not having those sorts of steps done at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know you and I have worked on projects together and independently of one another, even before working together on the third stage team. And one of the things that I know we've seen, on clients together, and I suspect you may have seen this in your past too, is that you get so enamored by technology oftentimes that the technology becomes the centerpiece instead of the operating model. And so that, that subtle nuance sort of changes the focus. I mean, what would you say to someone who's saying, well, why would we worry about our operating model? We're just going to go find, SAP or Oracle, implement that, and then that'll sort of determine what our operating model is. How would you respond to that objection or that thought?
Well, it's interesting. I had the same question asked of me yesterday from a client. It's one of those things where it's trying to help them understand because they have challenges, they have pain points. And so the reason they're putting technology in usually is to overcome those challenges. And it's misguided in a sense because the vendors sort of say, well, yeah, technology will fix it all. But what is quite important to recognize is the reason those pain points are there is because it's more about process and how they operate. Technology is just a component of that. And so when we start talking about how we would address and overcome some of those pain points, like lack of capital money, running out of operational expenditure, running out of those sorts of things, you start to tie it back and say, well, you could actually improve what you do just by the way you operate. And the technology is only going to support that. It's not going to be the complete answer to that. And so it's an interesting discussion because it's hard to get your head around because many people think operating model, well, I'm centralized, I'm decentralized. As many of the big consulting firms come in and believe that operating model is for you. It's, that second level is where, how are we going to operate? Now we're growing, context has changed. There's disruptors that have happened in our world. Is our operating model still the same as what it has been in the past? And that's why you need to consider those things up front because your context has changed. And so technology is only going to either enhance that or cause you some more issues.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. So on the, I guess on that, along those lines with does the technology drive the business operating model, or does the operating model drive the technology? Is that true in most cases that you see that is best practice? Would you consider that best practice to sort of define your operating model first, or does it depend on the client, or how would you determine the right approach there?
Your operating model depends on the client and the type of industry you're in and the type of organization you are. Technology is really it should only support it and influence, the operating model should influence what technology is and how you use that technology. So to try and put technology first to actually create your operating model, and it's interesting that many people talk about best of breed or the leveraging technology best of breed. Well, that just makes me the same as everybody else. And so if I was an organization that wanted to be more competitive, a leader in my market, and I was best of breed, then I'm only as good as what technology is telling me to be. Whereas the operating model leverages how I can actually be the best I can be within my industry as such. We can do things in certain ways that give us, and I think the American version of that is what they call secret sauce. It's that competitive advantage that many people are looking to have in a really, really, it's a competitive world we're in, sort of thing. And so if we don't consider how we operate different than just having technology that is the same as everybody else's, then we're not getting any advantage. It's like when we play a sport, every team within that particular discipline actually plays a sport, but only a few are premiers or win the Super Bowl at the end, sort of thing. And so why is that the case? Is they play the game better. So their operating model is actually more refined than everybody else because they play by the same rules. The rules are actually no one plays different rules. It's just they learn how to play them better. And I suppose that's the best analogy I find with getting a very good operating model in place is look at a sporting team. There's not a lot of differences that they have apart from players and how you play the game. Not necessarily, the rules. Rules is like the technology. That's the bit that's I suppose the leveler for everyone.
Yeah, that's a great analogy and a really good point that ties it back to, success and failure rates in the industry. I mean, so many of these transformations fail largely because people are doing things out of order. They don't have the right strategy. They don't have the right approach to deploy the technology. It's usually not because the technology doesn't work or the technology is broken. It's usually because we haven't managed this whole concept of, what we want to be when we grow up and letting that dictate how we run our project versus I'm going to go buy SAP, Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics, whatever the product is, and I'm going to defer to that product and let that determine for me what processes or best practices are most appropriate for me. And I think that difference oftentimes can separate, in your analogy, the winners versus the losers in transformation success versus failure.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's one of those things when you see organizations that are really understanding of an operating model or their place in their industry, you see the success they have and the way they actually approach things. When you look at organizations that think, I'll get the silver bullet or the magic pill or whatever, which is technology, and they get lost in it because what vendors sell people isn't actually the complete picture, because technology is only a component. It's a feeder. If you don't have processes, if you don't have understanding of how you actually are going to use those processes, if you don't have architecture that actually supports that, then you've really just got technology. That's it, which it can be limiting in the way you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit a really important point that I think is worth maybe highlighting a little bit, which is that if you're a customer, if you're a CIO or CFO or any sort of part of any organization that's about to go through a digital transformation, and you go talk to software vendors, generally they're going to tell you, if you were to present this concept to them, like, hey, we're going to define our operating model first, then we're going to bring in the technology to support that. What I've found, and I'm curious to see if you agree with this, is most of the time vendors will say, no, don't worry about the operating model. Our software has best practices, it's pre-configured for your industry, and that's just a waste of time to do that operating model stuff or that future state definition. Let our software do that for you. I mean, how do that? It sounds good. I mean, it sounds like that's what I would love to hear, or I'd love that to be true, because I would make life so much easier for everyone if the technology could just sort of figure it out for us. But I found that to not be the case. What's your experience been?
Oh, exactly right. The vendors come in, and I think it's just a ploy to say, well, if I can make you feel at ease that what you're putting in is going to solve all of those problems, then you won't go and look anywhere else, or you won't actually maybe look at a different software because you realize that the software we're offering may not deliver everything that you're looking for. And I think they get a bit scared on that, and so they're very good at convincing people that, don't worry, we've got all of the answers you need, and we've actually got in our particular offering, we actually have a version that suits your industry, and it's best of breed. And that whole vision of best of breed is often overstated, because what is best of breed? As I said, is that just the leveler that everybody wants to work off? I've worked in probably thousands of businesses, and I've never seen every business work the same way. So how could best of breed work for a competitive business? So maybe a government instrumentation, sort of thing, where they're actually working, following government rules or whatever, but even they work differently across different regions, across different parts of the world, globally. So how can you have one technology platform say, I'm best of breed, and all of your problems will be solved? It's a bit hard to, when you step back, it's only when you step back you can see that. But many times when you're in the spotlight of the vendor, offering you and really sort of putting up some benchmarks, and you start looking at, the magic quadrants and those sort of things, and they sort of lead you to believe that everybody's heading towards this best of breed, when really that's just not really the case. It just means that people are actually putting in certain platforms, but they're still configuring, and they still need to configure them in a certain way that actually satisfies their business as such.
Yeah, great points. And I always try to empathize with the situation and understand the dynamics at play in any sort of situation like that. And I always look at, what if I were a software vendor sales rep? What would I be telling people, or why would a sales rep say those sorts of things? And you have to look at what their incentives are. Their incentive is to sell you on their software as quickly as possible. And if you start focusing on operating model and stuff that sort of gives you a blueprint for how to deploy technology, or if it creates any sort of doubt that technology is going to be the right answer for you, obviously I'm going to try to override that to try to sell you, like, why don't you just sign the contract now? Let's just get our software in there, and then I'll make my commission and you can go implement it. Well, I'll be happy, right? I mean, it's sort of the human dynamic or human behavior at play. And so you just have to recognize it for what it is and say, well, let's look at what's best for our business. And I think your point is really well taken too. The point about, if every system, if there were systems out there that had best of breed or best practices, whatever you want to call it, then what advantage would any organization have over another organization? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, it seems like you alluded to this a little bit in your last response, but it seems like you have sort of two subsets of business processes. You have your commodity processes, like your accounts payable and GL, your period end close processes, things that they're not the same across organizations, but you could probably live with whatever technology can or can't do, or, and I'm generalizing here, but in general, those processes are more commoditized and a little bit more vanilla. But when you look at things that are more specific to your customers or your product, or if you're a engineer to order complex product, there's probably processes that are unique to you that give you some sort of edge, or that could give you some sort of edge that you want to define up front and then figure out how the technology fits. So have you seen that work before, where you sort of bifurcate or separate into two buckets, the vanilla processes, and maybe you don't spend as much time defining the operating model, and then over here with these competitive advantage or secret sauce processes, you go deeper into those areas?
Yeah, it's a good point you raised there, because it's I probably, as you talk through that, it's like I've generalized, but there are best of breed in the sense of everybody creates an invoice, everybody creates a accounts payable process. So those sort of things you can say, well, they are standardized processes, and the more streamlined they are and the more simple they are, then that's what you're trying to get, because obviously that adds to additional transaction costs, which is internal costs within the business. But the other processes you talk about, those ones that are competitive advantage ones, they're the ones that you want to be able to have control of. So it is almost two different focuses on it. So one is the commodity type ones, your accounts payable, your finance, your traditional type things that there is a lot of consistency and a lot of standardization in that, which I think is helpful that organizations consider that, because many organizations complicate that part of it. And so you can see where processes are very important, in the sense that if I streamline that, I actually bring more time available back in my organization to do the things I need to do for the people who are doing those roles, instead of fighting fires. But the other part is looking at, how do I actually improve processes that actually really add value to my business? And I suppose that's that secret sauce piece. So it's about understanding that both are important, and both actually add value to your business. So taking complexity out is important, but the other piece is leveraging how you go about what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to continue the conversation with Wayne, talking about operating models. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after this quick break.
Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in dark, walk around.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Like I should. When in dark, walk around the neighborhood, feeling blessed.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here chatting with Wayne Holtham, and we're going to cut back to the interview here. We're talking about operating models within transformation. So take it away, Wayne. So I want to come back to that thread here in a minute, but in the meantime, we've gotten a few questions and comments that from the audience here. I'm checking, looks like LinkedIn and Crowdcast here. We have a few comments. So I'll start with Crowdcast here, and I think you can see this probably on your screen, Wayne. But Saif Chowdhury made an observation. As per my experience, clients like to seek the vendor that provides pre-configured processes that can be then used as a starting point for workshops to tweak. And that's an interesting point, or an interesting question, or an interesting topic to maybe unpack a little bit. What about that concept of, hey, okay, fine, you want to, Mr. or Mrs. Client, you want to implement, or you want to define your operating model. Let's have us come in, the software vendor, system integrator. We'll come in and we'll guide those workshops based on best practice, and then you could tweak those best practices to fit your operating model, your desired future state. Is that how does that work? Is that a good approach? Is it a watered down approach of what you're suggesting, or what do you think?
Well, I usually find it ends up being a slanted towards technology approach, because what they're trying to lead you to do is say, well, and they're very well versed in it. So if they start talking about certain processes, they you'll need this extra piece of technology to be able to make that happen. And so it ends up being an additional aspect to the sales process, instead of saying, what do I really need? And many times you find that when you've had a vendor drive that, you end up with a lot of shelfware later, because what they actually sold you really doesn't work to actually satisfy. When you get down into the detail, you go, that doesn't work for us. Bad luck. I've already bought that. So that will sit there. And so that's one of the challenges when you have the vendor driving that, because there's no objectivity. And when you look at what they do, is they don't know your business. They have never worked in your industry. And so how would they actually have the specialist depth of how it operates to be able to make the technology work? So they really only come in from that side, is the technology side.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it seems especially true for, call it the bigger ERP systems. So like the SAP S/4HANAs of the world, the Oracle ERP Cloud, Microsoft Dynamics 365, those big ERP systems, generally you're more likely to run into issues or situations where the technology just doesn't do what you need it or want it to do. But in those workshops, to your point, they'll say, okay, well, let's figure out a workaround, or here's an alternative. And that's okay, but oftentimes it gets really watered down, and it's just a limitation of the technology, or you're sort of boxing yourself in, you're sort of compromising what you really want and need out of your operating model when you take that approach. And maybe there's parts, like if you're doing an S/4HANA implementation, maybe there's parts of your organization that shouldn't be using S/4HANA. That's not a terrible thing to admit and say, well, maybe we shouldn't use S/4HANA for CRM. Maybe we should go use Salesforce. Maybe Salesforce is a better fit. So to your point, yeah, you don't want to get sucked into saying, okay, well, we'll just buy the whole product for across the enterprise without really knowing what our future state operating model is, because you're probably going to end up with some parts of the business that just don't function well.
Yeah, and what they tend to do is actually blindside you to actually what other options are there. So like you say, Salesforce or something else might actually be a better fit. But you will never get that if you've actually invited the vendor in to actually do those early workshops, because as far as they're concerned, there is nothing else in the world apart from their particular piece of software. And so it's not until later that you actually realize, geez, if only I'd done this. But you're with an ERP for how many years? On average, 15 years is the time you're with an ERP platform. So it's not something you're going to change straight away. You're just stuck with it, and that's a real problem, because if you're putting something in, you don't want to be something that holds you back after you've deployed. You want to be able to really get that value back out of that huge spend that you've just gone through.
Yeah, absolutely. Get that ROI that you're looking for. So a couple other comments, actually. Here's a couple things from LinkedIn here. There's one person, Jeff Weber, says operating model is the horse and technology is the cart, which that's a maybe even simpler analogy than the sports analogy you used earlier. And I like that. It's which comes first, the horse or the cart. And then a question here from Rajendra Singh Negi. I may have butchered your last name or all of your name. I apologize for that. His question is, get data about organization and processes. Tech could help, which leads to the operating model. Get technology to help. I'm not 100% sure what he's asking here, but it sounds like he's asking, or maybe making a comment that technology supports the operating model, and it helps the business model versus being driven by technology or driving the operating model. It sounds like is what he might be alluding to there.
I think one of the things there with technology determining your operating model, there are some tools out there that actually will help you actually understand how you operate as such. And so there is some technology that will help guide you with that. But it's not what your ERP platform or CRM or HCM technology is. It's you finding the gaps within it to actually guide how you should operate. So it is an informer as such if you use the technology in that way, but we're talking different technologies. And so one is a understanding and insight and allows you to be able to monitor that you are maintaining your operating model and the procedures that sit underneath that, process sit underneath that. So that technology is there in place. And I think it's probably becoming more mainstream as people look at that to actually guide them on the bigger piece of their journey is the larger implementation of an ERP, a CRM, whatever that might end up being. So yes, there is some technology that can help you understand how you are operating, so to give you a bit of insight. So it's just not a guess as such.
Yeah, and actually I want to come back to that point. I have an article I was going to refer to in a question I'm going to ask you here in a second. So hold that thought, because that's a really interesting one. Here's a comment here on Crowdcast or a question from Sam Graham, and I had a chance to read this question while you were responding to the last one. I really like this question, and it's something that has been a theme with other interviews I've conducted recently in our podcast for or with past clients and current clients. But the comment is, or the question/comment is, when I've worked with Japanese companies, and by the way, this is, if I didn't mention, this is from Sam Graham. When I've worked with Japanese companies, I've noticed that when they launch into a project, they spend a lot of time thinking about what they are going to do and then not much time doing it. In the West, companies spend as little time as possible planning and then much more time actually doing. That suggests that they believe that the silver bullet exists and that they can solve all their problems by buying into best practice. Should software vendors define best practice is the question. And he might have other responses to the rest of his comments as well.
Well, I think it actually sums it up well in the sense that if you put the planning in at the beginning and you have the understanding of what you actually want, when the questions are asked by the solution integrator or the vendor, what do you want from us, sort of thing, you actually are very, very clear on that. Whereas what happens normally is there's this process in the West where, we do heaps of workshops, we identify all of the pain points we have, which is the past as such. But then we go, oh, well, technology will fix that, but we don't actually put the link together on how it's going to fix it or what it's going to mean. And so, whereas I think the Japanese put a lot more of that planning in at the start and say, well, we need to get down into the detail. And then when we roll it out, there's a much better chance it's far quicker, it's less disruption, because we've got on that journey, we've actually a lot of people understanding what we're doing. Whereas from the Western side, it's about, we do all of these other workshops, and then it's not until people actually get the system and go, that's not really what we wanted, sort of thing. And so, because they weren't brought along that journey. And I think that's a very good point you raised there about early planning, understanding what you want, knowing your requirements, and getting the solution integrator and the vendors to deliver that to you, not ask them what it needs to be, because they'll only deliver you what they think you need, which, there's a gap. Right.
Yeah. And just to build on your point and Sam's point, I recently spoke with and interviewed on this podcast, actually, a client who's the CFO at a client in out of our European office is where we were working with this client. And he had commented on the fact that they were part of a carve out. So his organization was spun off from a parent company, and they had, I think it was 12 months to stand up a new ERP system, because they had to get off the old one within 12 months and be self-sufficient. So they were under a pretty significant time crunch. And so I was asking him, how did you meet that time frame? Because that's pretty aggressive and you're sort of under the gun. Most organizations aren't quite under that much pressure. They might be under some more other pressure. So I asked him, what was the key to getting it done in that quickly? And he said, spending time planning. It was all about the planning we did up front. And then I said, well, how long of those 12 months did you spend planning versus the actual execution of the transformation? And he said he wasn't exactly sure, but he said it was about 60%. So I said, so over 6 months. He said, yeah, it was definitely over 6 months of the 12 months that we had to implement, we spent planning. And I think, to Sam's point, one of the big challenges or problems you have, if you hear 12 months, you think, oh, we better start doing stuff. Let's get a vendor in here. Let's just start doing workshops. Let's start configuring, designing and configuring. But that just leads you, it may feel like you're going faster, but you're just creating a bunch of problems that are going to add to your time frame later on.
Oh, that's right. And when you actually ask the vendor, they'll give you a response, and then you get the response back, you go, oh, I'm not sure what that actually means. And so then you spend time trying to work out what it actually means. And so that time just keeps slipping and slipping away. Whereas if you're really clear on what you've done and what you're deciding up front, then the responses back to the vendor, from the vendor or the solution integrator, are very clear. And so all of a sudden you go, yep, I can act on that. I can make a decision. I don't need to, clarification becomes less. And so the planning ends up leading you along the journey faster. And like you say, you can spend a lot of time thinking you're doing something because you're asking questions, but really if you're not getting the answers and you're just constantly in that circle of trying to get understanding, then you're just wasting time.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. One question here, I'm trying to think of what order to go in here just to keep a flow, but one question we had here that I think you alluded to a little bit early in the conversation, but maybe it's worth rehashing, especially for people that are joining mid-conversation here. But Shalita Amarin asked the question on LinkedIn, what is included in the operating model? So when you define operating model, just what is included within that?
That's a good question. So in an operating model, you need to be able to have what the governance is of the organization, what the I suppose the competitive driver of the organization is, how you're actually going to measure performance should be part of your operating model, what drives performance, and obviously then the processes that are going to lead you to deliver that performance. So there's those areas that you consider when you're developing that operating model.
Gotcha. Okay. And then actually we had a first question come in on YouTube here. And that question is from Romeo from London. He asks, what is your opinion on senior management interference in dictating project budgets and deadline without a proper understanding of project processes? Maybe I'll just add to that, maybe a sort of a sub question there is, how do you leverage the operating model to help you define what that, what that time, duration, and cost might be?
It's interesting because when you actually start looking at the operating model, you start to realize the impact to the business that this transformation is going to be. Many times you have executives feel as if they've got a number in mind, and it's really difficult because you have software vendors come in and they say, we'll give you a benchmark price on what it would actually cost to implement this software. And what you find is many times that price is to be able to it's the test the water price. Is that how much money you actually have? But they don't really want to make it so that it really seems overwhelming. And so for them, they actually say, well, we know that this price will probably get us across the line. And so that cements it in the executive's mind, which puts pressure on the project then because not everything's considered. They don't consider the level of change that's involved. They don't consider the amount of disruption to the organization. They don't consider all of those other sort of things, which become a pressure on a project later on if it hasn't been considered. And so, and sometimes if you're just tweaking your operating model, the change to your business isn't as much. So you don't need to factor in that. But vendor is not going to know that. And so they usually go with, what's a price that I think I can actually get this across the line? It's the sales process. When I'm buying a car, I don't tell someone the recommended price. I try and get out of them how much they want to spend, and then can we fit in there? And that's usually how it works.
Right. And then there's actually a follow-up question from Romeo from London, and we'll just kind of keep going with this thread since it's relevant to what you just said. So his follow-up question is, do you think that senior management should be trained in project management processes? So it's sort of related to that. I think it's about expectation setting and educating senior management is what his question is related to there.
I think that the senior management is there for a particular. If we train them to be project managers, then I think that'd be even worse of a problem. I think the thing is they need to be able to understand the objectivity. It's about educating them and asking them the right questions so that the decisions they're making end up working with delivering a platform, not delivering what a vendor has sold them as such. And I think that's the disconnect. Process management practices should be very clear. And if we follow them appropriately and properly, we end up where we get a good outcome. I think the challenge we have is that if people don't understand what the project is, when those big decisions are made, you find that they're actually contradicting or holding you back when you're actually trying to implement a project. And that's where the challenge in project management comes. You can't get decisions when you need them. You're constantly then asking for position papers, which is losing time. And for a project manager, if I've got a set timeline, I don't want delays. And so these are some of these things that hold up a project, because the senior executive really isn't understanding of what they're actually doing as such. They're not being presented with information to make decisions as they need to make them. And so there is an education piece for senior executives to understand what it takes to deliver one of these programs. I think we run a boot camp to be able to onboard executives for that very reason. So they really understand these questions are going to be posed to you. And so are you ready to be able to answer those? Because when they come, they're going to come, and you need to answer, move on, and that keeps the project rolling.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So a commenting question here from Kiran Patel on Crowdcast. He says, it seems the Japanese way has advantages in planning ahead. What is the typical time it takes to plan business processes before engaging a vendor?
It's interesting. If you've been involved with process mapping over the times, there is times when they can take many months and many years. And organizations I've walked into, you ask the question, they say, yeah, we've mapped our processes and we understand them completely, and we've got 5 different versions of them over the time. So, sometimes we get caught up in the fact of not really mapping process. We try and predict what as is. And one of probably the greatest advances in technology that's happened lately is the fact that we can actually now start to see what is. It's a big difference in the sense that, many times we'll sit in a workshop where people will put a lot of post-it notes on the wall and go, we do this process. But if you were to talk to someone actually down on the shop floor, they would go, well, we don't actually do that process because it doesn't work. So we have a workaround about that. And that's not evident. And so it's about now leveraging what do people actually do. And there's some tools that allow you to be able to do that quickly, as against the old way of doing it, where we're actually putting, we're asking people because people will only tell you what they want to hear. And are we asking the right people what's actually happening? So middle managers are the ones who are probably least informed about what's actually happening in organization when it comes to some of those basic processes.
Right. Yeah. And then a follow-up question, or part 2 of Karan's question here is, what high-level step is recommended based on experience if it was a Microsoft Dynamics implementation, for example, I think he's asking about sort of building on that previous question about planning the business processes or the operating model prior to engaging a vendor. What is that, what are those high-level steps that someone should take to get to that point where you're actually leveraging or engaging with the senior or with the software vendor?
I think if you get your operating model right, then I look at functional architecture. So what does that operating model do? What modules am I going to need to be able to do that? If I'm in an industry where, and lots of times now we're expecting more parts of the organization to interact with the system. And so we have mobility devices now, we have those sorts of things. Whereas in the past, we came in with a piece of paper or some information and someone typed it into the system, and that's how we operated. We now have many more people getting information back into our system, whether it be through mobility, whether it be through portals, customer portals, all those sorts of things. And so we need to then understand, well, what software are we going to need to actually deliver that for us, and how are we going to get consistency of how that is actually we capture the data. So we want to be able to make sure that information we get is consistent and actually doesn't cause us more problems. And so though the functional architecture is probably the next piece to deliver it, and then by then you should be able to go to the vendor and start to get an idea of what they have available and how they could actually satisfy those scenarios that you're actually looking to satisfy.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I'm going to open a can of worms here to warn you here, or I'm not going to. I don't shoot the messenger, Wayne. I'm just asking the question that the audience is asking here. But I think this is a good topic here, or a good thread. So this is from Rashid on YouTube, is asking a question here. He's basically asking the question about the planning that we talked about, spending 60% in the example I gave, about spending all this time up front with planning. And he says, but most customers want Agile and 15-day releases. What do you think about clients who want Agile and Scrum implementations and sprint releases? So how does this all, and this is a great topic. I love this question because it is sort of a balancing act or a challenge that a tightrope you have to balance out in these implementations. What about Agile and Scrum and that whole sprint mentality? How does that fit into this whole operating model concept?
That ends up being in the delivery approach and how you select and deliver your platform. I suppose, I hope I don't want to upset anybody, but Agile, if you look at what Agile is, Agile was set up to actually develop software. And so you end up with a very clear objective of what you're looking to do for a defined piece of development as such. Whereas when we apply that to a very complex digital transformation, there are many, many pieces that Agile struggle to do, because if we try to roll out things quickly, what we do is we end up doing lots of pieces, but we end up with what I call an air gap. So the air gap between them. So we have lots of pieces that don't actually fit together because they don't follow that flow of, we need to get to this point, but we've got so many extra complexity things feeding it that we miss things along the way. And so that's where Agile really struggles in the complex. There's a lot of people who say, the scrums work really well, and there's a whole lot of technology out there that's meant to do it. I'm just been involved in a massive project, and it's gone down the Agile route. And I think it probably adds an extra 30% of cost onto your organization, because by the time you get to the end where you're starting to go, I need to close design, I need to make sure my processes are in place. I need to understand what changes I've made. All of a sudden, you get a lot of those gotcha moments. We didn't consider that. We forgot that. We missed that. And they're the sort of things that extend timelines. And not to say that they may have just delivered Agile or managed the Agile process poorly. That could be the case. But I still see that gap happens when people apply Agile in its rawest form. I think it needs to be a bit of a hybrid. We've got a waterfall approach where things do cascade, and it probably keeps us online in some ways. But the Agile piece is parcels of work we could do to actually, satisfy the requirements. So it really does need to be not just a straight Agile for the sake of we're just Agile.
Yeah, and I think it's well put that you can have that hybrid approach. You can spend that time up front defining your operating model and have a very clear blueprint vision for how you're going to deploy technology and deploy the changes through the organization. But then you could go to the sprint mentality in terms of how you execute. But when you start off with that sprint mentality, I find that oftentimes, yes, we're sprinting, but we're going in the total wrong direction here. We should be going this other way, and so we're sprinting the wrong way. So good news, we're going fast. Bad news, we're going the wrong direction. So I think that dynamic longer term will cost you more than the intent of sprint, or the intent of Agile is meant to be. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue and wrap up this conversation with Wayne. We'll take more audience questions. We have a lot more audience questions we're going to get to as it relates to operating models, and we actually talk about a lot of other stuff in that context too. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back on Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. We're going to finish up the interview with Wayne and talk more about operating models and take more questions from the audience. So we'll cut back to the interview right here. So we're getting a bunch of questions here on LinkedIn, actually. So I'll pull a couple here. One of it's more of a comment, I believe, and see if you have a response to this, Wayne. But this is from Evan Bombeki on LinkedIn. And he says, Romeo's question seems directly related to one of the approaches to mitigating IT implementation risk, according to Apex, performing due diligence on proposals by interviewing previous purchasers and using third-party evaluators. And I forgot, so Romeo was the one that was asking the questions about, I forgot which ones he was asking. So he's referring to Romeo's question. I apologize, I don't remember which one was Romeo's. But what are your thoughts here on mitigating implementation risk by performing due diligence on proposals, by interviewing previous purchasers or previous customers and using third-party evaluators?
I think that's a great option, because how do you actually get that independence? How do you actually get what is real? And it's interesting. I recently did a survey of a number of organizations that have implemented S/4HANA over the last probably 2 to 3 years. And when you actually have been through the process where the vendors are trying to sell you S/4HANA, and they talk about its level, its maturity, it's all those sort of things, and then you talk to the people who've actually implemented and the gaps that were involved in that, I think it's a really helpful process to actually have that ability to be able to have that insight when you go in, because your discussion with the vendor becomes a bit of a different discussion. It's how we're going to work to overcome these challenges. Not to say you're not going to buy it, but how we're going to overcome these challenges that we recognize are there, as against, no, they were never there until you actually have bought it, and then they're there sort of thing. So, and that independent piece is ask those questions that most it's interesting, because organizations get caught in the sales thing of, well, we don't really ask them that because that might make us seem, like we don't know what we're doing, or those sort of things. Whereas an independent, truly independent organization will actually ask those questions that makes the vendor squirm, because that's what they should be doing. They should be actually being honest and genuine, and being able to say, well, we would deal with it this way, and here's how we would do that. Whereas an organization either doesn't know how to ask that question, or doesn't feel comfortable in asking that question. So it's really a good piece, a good thing, practice to employ someone who can be that objective person in the middle, that isn't afraid to ask those questions, has experience on what you need to do so that you actually get the best outcome.
Right. Good. It's funny because some of the people that were on Crowdcast now are on LinkedIn, so I'm getting confused because they're saying, "Oh, I was the one over on Crowdcast that asked you this. Now I'm going to ask you this over on a different platform." So I apologize if I'm missing anyone here. So what about this? What is your opinion of non-IT professionals recruiting IT-related staff like business and less product owners?
It is interesting where we actually we engage people on the fact that their price point in the marketplace is cheap enough for us to accept, not their experience level. And I often see that where we actually have recruiters come in and they will fill a project full of people because they were the people in the market, but their criteria didn't actually consider the type of platform we're putting in or the experience level of those people. They just sort of filled the recruiters, I suppose, inbox, and so they presented those options. And when you get into a project where, and it's a classic, especially if you've got organizations that are going to say SAP that weren't SAP before, and if you've got a whole team that's actually implementing that and they have no understanding of the complexities of SAP, then what you find is that they don't understand what you need to do. And so that's where you get a bit of that half-baked type thing. So, processes are ultra important when you're doing SAP, understanding how you're doing those sort of things. When you've got other platforms that might be a bit more flexible, processes can, be close. But with SAP, you've got to be very defined, very clear on what you're doing. And so people who don't have that experience can cause a lot of problems because they just really don't understand how it operates at the end of the day, or what's the user going to have to do at the end of the day to actually make this thing work.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So another question here is from Susana Carrion she's from Spain. So we have at least two people I know of that are from Spain here on the live stream. So apparently we have a huge following in Spain from what I can tell. But Susanna's question is, there are some ERP vendors that have such a quick approach that it's supposed to help the implementation phase, making it in a shorter timeline. All processes supported by the ERP are already mapped from the beginning. Do you think this type of approach can really help defining the operating model joined with the client or in conjunction with the client?
I think the gap there is that the notion that they could actually have them predefined to start with, because as we talk about this, it's that concept of best of breed, and so what you find, this is a challenge with some of the cloud options where they have a very, very defined, clear. They don't want you to change. They don't want you to customize. They want everybody to be on the same version, the same configuration. And if you've got a very simple business, that's probably okay to be able to do. But the more complex you get, the harder that is to be able to manage, because again, you will have different needs, different requirements, whether it be compliance needs, whether it be the way you operate, whether it be that secret sauce, that's going to guide that. And so where we have these out of the can type configurations, for some organizations that are very simple, yeah, that might work. But you know, there's not a lot of those around, you know, and I think that's the thing to recognize, is that for the limited few that they actually do satisfy, we shouldn't overshadow that and say that everyone's the same. And I think that's the problem that vendors have gotten into, because for them, it's much cheaper to actually have a software that everybody uses exactly the same way. Because when I do upgrades, when I do changes, when I do anything, it's simple for me as a software. It's my cheapest option. Anybody who wants extra costs me more, because I have to consider their needs when I'm actually rolling out upgrades and doing those sorts of things. And so it's more expensive for me as a vendor. So it's a bit of a selfish thing for the vendors. And you know, it's probably their operating model is to actually get to the point of being as simple and as cheap, and get as many people on the same version, same platform, same configuration, because it makes sense, but not for the organization who's going to use it. That's the problem.
Right. Yeah. No, it's very true. And again, it gets back to that point of, you know, just understanding where the vendors are coming from and what their self-interest, you know, what self-interest might be driving the vendors, which is okay. That's their prerogative to sell you software and to do what they can to try to sell you software. But at the end of the day, you have to back up and look at your business and figure out what's best for us and figure that out first. And it's hard to do. Like you said, it's hard to do because we're all human and we don't want to let people down, or we don't want to seem like we don't know what we're doing, or if we don't have confidence in that approach, we're going to defer to, well, the vendor is the expert. They're telling us that we should just start deploying technology and, you know, using Agile or whatever. But you know, I think it's a matter of educating yourself too. And in fact, just to build on that, Scott Martin on Crowdcast here made a comment of related to that whole concept of Agile. He was kind of building on that thread and saying, he would ask, would you provide some details on what you mean by Agile implementation? You know, if an executive is telling you that we should be using Agile, and then use that as an opportunity to educate the client. And I think that's really important, because I think with all the stuff we're talking about here, I mean, whether we do it the way we're recommending, or, you know, the way a lot of organizations will do it, which is to lead with the technology and then figure out the business process stuff later, no matter which approach you take, there's always going to be risks and trade-offs. So I think it's a matter of really recognizing that none of this is a silver bullet. Even what you're saying, what I'm saying, none of this fixes everything. I mean, it gives you what we think is a better path and a path of least resistance, but it's not going to solve all the problems. There are going to be other risks along the way that need to be addressed.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a question here around business process mining tools. Maybe we could spend a couple minutes on this. And actually, I don't know if you saw this article, Wayne, but there was an article, and I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. I thought I had it in front of me, and it crashed on me, or the window crashed out on me. But it was a article about an SAP implementation that I'm just going to see if I have it on my phone here, because it was a really good article. It was an article in the Register, and it was about the pharmaceutical firm GSK, and they had implemented SAP ECC, so not S/4HANA, but the legacy SAP product. They'd implemented, I think, 10 years ago, and they thought they had a common operating model. They had defined sort of a standard business process or set of business processes when they first deployed the technology, but then they used this process mining tool. I forgot which one, but they used that process mining tool to go in and eventually discovered that they had actually 28,000 variations on one single process. It was, I think, the sales order process. So they took just one micro process that they thought was being standardized, and then they used the process mining tool to see how people were actually using the system and how the processes were actually flowing, and that there's 28,000 variations. And they found that most of those didn't need to be variations. They could have been using a standard process. So I guess, first of all, what is a process mining tool? And then maybe we can come back to that point about how do you avoid that problem of this proliferation of, thousands of different variations of the same process.
Yeah, interesting discussion there. And it's great you bring this up because it's something that I've been involved in just recently and see the value of it. So a process mining tool, what it does, it actually takes a snapshot of the digital fingerprint people have when they actually go in and use the system. So as an organization, everybody, when they actually do a transaction, when they interact, they actually leave a fingerprint. And the process mining tool has an algorithm in the background that actually identifies where all those touch points were, and then it lines it with that standard process. So if you do that sales process, order to cash type process, you'll have it where, the information comes in. There'll be probably about 6 or 7 steps that actually guide that, which actually becomes what we would call a end-to-end process as such. But the challenge has been when we do process mapping, and which I was alluding to before, is that we would ask people, how do you do this? And they would give us those high level things of what we think we should do. When you overlay it with process mapping, process mining, you actually find that there are many, many hundreds of thousands of variations that people actually do. Things happen before they should do. There's reasons why, in a purchase to pay, it's interesting that you might find that where we have a purchase rec and a purchase order and, a goods receipt and an invoice, you think, oh, they're pretty simple. But then all of a sudden you're starting to get an invoice before you've actually done a purchase rec. And you go, well, we can cope with that. But then what does that mean? That means that I'm buying something that no one really, it's not even on my forecast, my radar to understand I'm going to have to pay for that. So have I forecast enough money for that? And so these are all of the challenges that we actually have. We can't actually see these unless we use something like a process mining tool. And I suppose there's a couple of recent developments when it comes to process mining tools, probably over the last 5 years. There's a couple of products that have really, and SAP has actually purchased a process mining tool that's been around for a while, and they've purchased it because that view of rolling out an ERP is complex, and they're finally getting that message that process is a big driver of that, and understanding the gap between what good standardized process might be as against what we actually do as an organization. And that's what often derails many of these programs. There was in Queensland, we did a podcast, I think a few months ago, sort of thing, Eric, and it talked about 16 different hospitals having a centralized system rolled out, and it failed. And the reason it failed is because they had 16 hospitals doing 16 different ways that they never considered. They've actually since done a process mining exercise and realized that that was the derailer of it all, is that those hospitals just continued doing what they were doing, but no one actually took the insight of saying, well, this standardized process is what we want you to do, but no one changed. And that's so process mining is a really, really valuable tool.
Yeah. And that's, in that case, makes you wonder, was it really just 16 variations, or were there within each of the 16 locations, did they have hundreds or thousands of different variations?
Actually in the hundreds of variations for each hospital. So you multiply that and that's what happens. So yeah.
Yeah, and if you haven't heard that interview yet, I really enjoyed that interview, and I thought we covered a lot of good ground in that interview. Just check my, actually it's on the, I think it's on the Third Stage YouTube channel. So if you go out to YouTube, just search up Third Stage and subscribe to it. Just search Queensland once you're on the channel. You'll find the interview with Wayne and I, and it's a fascinating, I think it's a fascinating case study, as are a lot of challenge projects, and it oftentimes leads back to business processes and process mining and all that stuff. So I think the last question I'll ask here before we wrap up, I think I've hit most of the questions. I know we didn't get to everything that the audience had, but first of all, thank you to the audience for such great questions. This is really interesting threads that we went down. But I want to make sure we cover the whole concept of change management as it relates to future state operating model. Maybe at a high level, and we could obviously spend a whole hour Q&A session just on change management, but maybe at a high level, just to give us a teaser or a flyover view, how does change management factor in or fit into this whole concept of operating model, or vice versa? How does operating model determine, our change management strategy?
It's interesting because we're working with an organization at the moment that's got this challenge. They've worked the same way for the last 20 years. And when you look at it, their industry has changed a lot. There's a whole lot of differences in the way they actually operate. There's more compliance. There's new disruptors in the market. And so all of a sudden, how we worked in the past is no longer how we can work in the future. And so change management becomes a huge part of it, because if I expect that people are going to be working the same way as they did in the past, but they don't have any guidance which the operating model's deciding for us, or we're deciding on how we're going to operate, the change management piece is taking them on that journey. So where you gave someone a piece of paper in the past to actually put information in, you're going to actually be doing it yourself on a mobility device. That's a change journey in itself. Understanding the different rules and different drivers that we actually have and we're going to be measured on is a change journey. And so that needs to be considered, and how wide that chasm is, or that gap is, for organizations from where they are today and how they operate to what this new world is going to look like, really takes, you need to work with people. You need to get people to understand. You need to get buy-in of those people to go, that makes sense. That's the reason why I want to do that, as against you must change, because how many of us humans accept you must change? And I think the change piece is often underestimated when we're talking about whole-scale digital transformation, because people need to understand why. And if we don't give them a why, there's just resistance, just the walls go up. And so it's a big area for organizations to, I think, get a handle on, which they often underestimate and think, oh, it's a cost. I can't see how I measure that value return and those sorts of things. And that's not a good way to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, change management is typically one of those things that is on the critical path to completion of a transformation, assuming there is a completion and not just sort of an ongoing improvement method. But in general, if you have X amount of time to implement a solution, it's change management is one of the things that will oftentimes delay if you haven't addressed it. And so one of the good things about what you're suggesting which is to bring that future state operating model work up front, is that allows you to get into the weeds sooner to determine what those impacts are going to be to the organization, so that we can develop a change strategy and start executing on a change strategy earlier, rather than waiting until we get to design and then build of the technology. By then you're so far downstream that you're playing catch up from a change management perspective. So
and usually by the time you get to that end, you're still only focusing on the technology. There's a lot more that an organization has to do apart from using the technology. And what you find is when you're at the stage of deployment, you're teaching people how to use the new technology. Often they don't have understanding of why they're using it, what they're doing. So it's almost like you're teaching a monkey how to push a button, and that's not, and people then go, well, I really don't understand why I'm doing this. I feel more comfortable with my old way. I'll stick to that once this goes live, because no one will be watching. So, and that's usually where the challenge comes after deployment, to actually get people using the system, is because all we've taught them how to do is use a technology that they don't really understand why they're doing it, why it's built that way, or why it makes sense to do it that way. Oftentimes when we haven't thought about it, it doesn't even make sense to do it that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then a good closing comment here from Satnam on Crowdcast. He makes a comment that most organizations think change management is just about training and communications, when it is much more than that. And I couldn't agree more with that comment. And to address those areas outside of training and communications, you need to get a jump start on this stuff that we're talking about today, which is the operating model and defining what that future state is going to be.
Yeah, because that sets people with, okay, that's why we're doing this, and that then gets them involved. Whereas many times we don't tell anybody until we've gotten to the point, oh, we've got this new system we're going to give you, and it's great, and that's not change management. And putting posters on walls is not change management. So I agree with you there, Saddam. Right.
And so I guess here's actually a really good closing question for this discussion here today, that I think it sort of, it puts a bow on this whole discussion. And this is from Joost Winnick from the Netherlands. I'm on, I think this is LinkedIn. I have so many things open, I can't remember which platform I'm on here, but I think this is LinkedIn. He said, with all the knowledge in the world that it is not easy, that these sorts of transformations are not easy at all, why do companies still think that it is? I don't know if you have an answer to that, but I mean, that's a good way to lead it. If you have some thoughts on that.
You've never been involved in a sales cycle for a vendor, because their whole thing is to take away the concern and make it feel as if, no, this will be a walk in the park because we've got your back. And soon you realize that's not actually the case. And so that's why many times we get caught into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. Well, Wayne, thanks a lot for your time. This is a great discussion. The time flew by. I can't believe it's already been over an hour, but this is really good discussion. And I think there's a lot of different directions we could go building on this, but I think this is a good overview of operating models and how that all ties into digital transformation and how it ties into other work streams of a digital or business transformation. So thanks very much for being here today. Appreciate it.
No, it's been great and some great questions, and I've enjoyed this topic. So really good. Thanks for letting me be part of it.
Absolutely. You can definitely sense your energy and enthusiasm for this topic. So I appreciate you being here. All right. Great conversation. Wayne, thanks for being on the show. That was a really interesting set of responses and discussion points. And I really appreciate the people that joined the live stream, which we do every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern time in the United States, or U.S. time. And love to have you join anytime if you want to be part of the show and ask questions of our guests, feel free to join those live streams on Fridays. And then typically within the next 2 episodes, you'll hear that segment on Transformation Ground Control. So when we come back, we're going to talk more about operating models and business process improvement and all that good stuff. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Give me the sense to wonder if I'm free.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things digital transformation. So, Paresa, that was sort of a epic, very long interview with Wayne. I enjoy it, but what were your thoughts? What are some of your observations after hearing that segment?
Epic is a good word for it, I'd say. Wayne is he's genius, I think. Just his perspectives and the way that he explains it almost brings it down to layman's terms, and it's easy to understand, so I can appreciate that on Wayne's part. So one thing he said that stood out to me is, it should be just common knowledge, right? But a lot of companies put technology at the center, right? Rather than letting it play a supporting role. And that's something that Wayne was talking about a lot, is that technology should be playing a supporting role in any organization, not being the main focal point. And it's kind of like money. I mean, it amplifies who you are. If you bring on a new system and you don't have that foundation, you don't have that secure operating model, it's going to show when you go live, in your processes and just how it's received, how it's functioning. So it's interesting to hear how much of a foundational role the operating model plays. So just to sum it up, I mean, he mentioned it comes down to governance. It's your competitive driver. It helps you dial in on your performance metrics and figure out your processes and your workflows. Now, and maybe cybersecurity based on what we were talking about earlier, given the day and age, right? So, I mean, looking at how big of a role it plays, it sounds like if you don't have your operating model in place, set and secure and planned out before you go into an implementation, you could be setting yourself up for ERP failure. So, I mean, have you seen that in any of in any cases that you've worked on, or have any examples of what exactly the impact is if you don't have a secure and stable operating model before you go into a digital transformation?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a try to simplify it to start on that thread as far as, what happens when you don't have that business process model or operating model in place. It's a lot like building a house. I mean, if you think about if you were going to have a new house built, the question would be, would you just start bringing in your roofers and your drywall guys and your electricians and the plumbers and all that stuff without having a clearly defined set of parameters for what you want the house to look like? And that's really the question that you have to ask. And a lot of times what happens is organizations fall victim or prey to this concept that's perpetuated by software vendors and system integrators, that you don't need to worry about the operating model. Our software will do the opposite of what you said, Paresa, which is our software is going to define for you what your operating model is. And that's just absolutely not true. Part of the reason it's not true is because, first of all, you're operating down at a transactional level. When you're dealing with software, you're down in the weeds by definition. You're defining how you're going to have different transactions flow and what buttons you push and what the screens look like and all that stuff. And if you do that absent of that overarching blueprint, if you will, or business process or operating model blueprint, you're just shooting in the dark. I mean, yeah, you might have a bunch of really good pieces put together here with your software vendor or system integrator, but how it ties together with end-to-end processes like Wayne talked about, that's a whole different story. And so what ends up happening if you don't do that, then it's a lot like how you would predict a house building would go if you didn't have a clear blueprint for all of your contractors and various people involved in the building of the house. You need to have that blueprint. And if you don't, what ends up happening in a transformation is just a lot of things. You get misalignment. You're not on the same page with what it is you're trying to accomplish because you haven't defined as a team what you want to be when you grow up. So either you end up arguing or there's misalignment or tension with the team, and or your system integrator will just take care of it for you and they'll define for you what you want to look like. And that is definitely not the right answer. So neither one of those are the right answer. So that's one symptom. Another symptom is you can't really focus on change management because you don't have a clear operating model defined. So your change management team ends up waiting until the software is built before they can really start any meaningful change management. So that's another I'd say a symptom of that problem. And then, project governance. It becomes very difficult to decide, do we want to customize the software? Do we want to configure it this way or that way? Decision-making becomes super difficult because you have no blueprint, you have no vision. And so your system integrator starts asking you questions of how you want the software to work and what your needs are. And you're probably, without having that clear blueprint, you're probably going to revert back to what you've always done because that's what you know and you haven't defined anything otherwise. And so what I'd say is if you're really aiming for process improvements and you're really trying to change your business, then I would say that operating model concept is really critical. Now, if you happen to be one of those few companies where, hey, our processes are great, we don't really need to improve them, we just need to upgrade our technology, then, okay, maybe it's not quite as important. You still want to do it, but it might not be quite as valuable. But I'd still suggest for any organization, even if you're doing a relatively simple, and I use the word relatively pretty strongly because no upgrade is simple, then you still want to have that operating model to some degree.
Right. Interesting. I mean, from those symptoms that you're sharing, it sounds like those are pieces that will elongate a transformation project, which in the past we've talked about that costs you more money. The longer an implementation takes, the more money you're forking out to your vendors, to everybody that's involved. So, I mean, and just as far as timelines, if you plan ahead and you spend a lot of time pouring into your operating model, you're going to probably save money because you're saving time. It's almost like a domino effect. If you don't get the first chain of the link of the chain right, then it's going to affect the whole project. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I'm glad you said that because I failed to mention that super important point in my response, which is, that is another symptom, is going over budget, taking longer than expected. And just to build even further, you probably recall there was a segment, I think there's a couple questions about Agile. We were talking about Agile a couple times throughout the conversation. And Agile, this whole concept of Agile runs counter to this operating model concept, because Agile oftentimes, and I'm generalizing, and I know I'll have Agile purists out there that are going to crucify me for saying some of this stuff. But in general, what you often see is that people will use Agile as an excuse to not do that upfront work. They just jump in and start building stuff. They try to get the minimum viable product. They try to put something in front of the users, get their response or get their feedback, and then go tweak it. and they're doing it in the name of speed. And I think in many ways, Agile is an overreaction to the fact that transformations have been so cumbersome and difficult in the past. So Agile is sort of a perceived way to speed things up. But to your point, if you do Agile or any other sort of fast implementation without taking that time up front to define your processes and your operating model, it's going to actually take you longer to get it right later on. You might get started faster, and it might look like you might feel like, it looks like you're moving faster on paper, but long term, that's typically going to take you longer because you're operating without a plan. So I think, you can use, if you have that operating model clearly defined up front, then you can start to use Agile in how you deploy, the technological solutions and roll out the process improvements that you've defined and all that good stuff. But I don't think you want to start out of the gates with skipping or bypassing that more waterfall-ish approach to defining your operating model clearly up front. So long-winded way of saying I totally agree with you. Time, cost, resources are optimized when you have a clear operating model.
Right. That makes total sense. And the other thing that Wayne was talking about, or that both of you guys were talking about, is that having a set operating model can act as your differentiator in the market and drive your competitive advantage. I mean, especially if you're a larger organization, if you can perform more efficiently than your competitor, then chances are it's going to trickle down to your customer experience as well. So I guess before I dive into the whole concept of operational excellence, which I want to chat about briefly, I'm curious, if a company dials in on their operating model, can they change it? Or is that like their core, kind of like their core values? Is that something that stays consistent over the years, even as the world changes, like almost like their mission statement or something? Or can they change it as time goes on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And operating models generally are sort of a living, or they should be a living, breathing type of thing. It really reflects a snapshot or a moment in time where you are operationally, or where you want to be operationally, at that moment in time. Now, over time, what ends up happening is your operating model, if that remains static, the reality is your processes are going to change and evolve over time. The question is, are you going to clearly define how those processes are going to change, or are people just organically going to tweak things and start messing with that operating model and letting it go, a million different directions? And that's usually what happens. Companies just sort of define the operating model and then they forget about it. And then what ends up happening, if you look out like 10, 15, 20 years, what ends up happening is if you don't have that clear operating model, then you're probably letting processes drift whatever direction people want to take them. And when I say people, I mean all of your employees. And then the technology is going to drift too, because technology is constantly changing. And especially if you're using a cloud solution, it's going to constantly upgrade and update. And that ends up drifting. And what ends up happening is 10, 15 years later, you have this divergence between where your processes actually are today and where the technology is, and your operating model that you intended is probably somewhere in the middle, and you're just completely misaligned. And then you freak out and say, I need a new ERP system, or I need new technology because they're broken. And what you find is, well, actually, it's not necessarily even broken. It's just that you let it, sort of drift apart from what you wanted. And so, I think the key there is to have that process governance and the operating model governance in place, in that mentality of continuous improvement, to where you're consciously tweaking and making deliberate decisions around what you want your processes to look like, rather than just letting it evolve however it's going to evolve. So to answer your question, it should be a living, breathing document, but what ends up happening is people sort of, even if they do what Wayne is suggesting in the discussion there, and you clearly define that operating model, it's not like one and done. You do it once and then you do it the next time you roll out technology in 10 or 20 years. You want to constantly update that along the way. Yeah,
that makes sense. I imagine a lot of operating models changed in 2020.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you think about restaurants and retailers, and just at a micro level or a local community level, think of all the businesses you interact with and how much they've had to change, or your doctor, your dentist. They've all had to change in some pretty significant way, and a lot of times that involves technology, or they're trying to figure out how technology could help them enable that business model. But even things behind the scenes that a lot of people don't see, or consumers don't see day to day, like B2B providers that are selling industrial products to another manufacturer or whatever. Even those businesses have changed, because not only are they dealing with remote workforces in some cases, or some of the challenges that every organization is facing, but then you have the supply chain disruptions that are being perpetuated or fueled by COVID in this post-COVID world. you also have now this expectation in the market that we can do more things digitally or electronically, and so even B2B providers are trying to find ways to use e-commerce or retail type of mentalities to provide better service to their customers. So I think everyone or most organizations in some way have been directly or indirectly impacted, in 2020 and beyond.
Absolutely. It just goes to show how important it is to be flexible as the world continues to change. I mean, talking about competitive advantage and using your operating model as a differentiator, it trickles into the conversation about operational excellence, which I know Dave Beldick just recently, he spoke on it at Digital Stratosphere, and he just recently wrote a piece about it. So diving into that, I mean, operational excellence, to me, it's when your operations are working seamlessly. Every department, every technology, all your processes are working synergistically. I guess the concept goes hand in hand in laying the groundwork for your operating model. So I guess one thing that I'm curious about is, this is about business process management and business process mapping, for example. It's looking at your current state, where are you now, and that helps you develop your operating model, right? So if that's the case, say you're about to go on a digital transformation. I know something that we talk about a lot is you need to think of the future state of your business when you're going into a transformation. Where do you want to be 5, 10, 20 years from now? Whereas this conversation is look at where you are today. What are your processes today? What is your governance today? And understand where you are before you implement a new technology. So I guess, can you help bridge the gap? Which is it? Is it, should we be looking at the future state, or should we be looking at where we are today? How do they relate to each other?
Yeah, that's a great observation and nuance that you're pointing out here, is that I'd say what it's not. You don't necessarily want to just define an operating model that solidifies or documents or codifies what you're doing today. Generally, you're looking to the future in some capacity. Now, the question is, are we looking 10 years out? Are we looking at what we think we want to be today or in the next 3 to 5 years? That's a tough question to answer. But in general, I'd say, most organizations we work with sort of know that the current state isn't working. That's why they've hired us, and that's why they typically want to go through some sort of transformation. So they know that much. They know the current state's not working. We know we're not just going to create an operating model to replicate it today. But the question is, are we looking 10 years out, or are we looking 3 years out, or 1 year out, or whatever the case may be? I would say that the further out you look, the more deliberate you have to be about how you're going to get there. So we could define an operating model for 5 to 10 years out, or what we think is going to work 5 to 10 years out, even though chances are fairly high that's going to need to be modified as things change over time. But let's just say you define that. Then we need to back into, okay, how are we going to get there? Because we're not just going to put in new technology and overnight we've gotten there. It's obviously a longer journey. So it's a matter of using that desired future state as a way to define what your overall strategy and roadmap is. And for a lot of organizations, especially larger multinational organizations, these transformations, these journeys can take several years. We have one client, for example, that's the largest steel producer in North America, and they're, I think, on year 4 or 4.5 of a 7-year transformation. And a lot of organizations just are baffled by that. They can't imagine a 7-year project. And, most organizations, to be fair, shouldn't take 7 years, but this is a massive company with a lot of different locations, and they're pretty complex business. So, in that state, you kind of want to know that we're going to define our operating model, and then we have to back into where we are today and then figure out the roadmap to get there. And then, by the way, along the way, in years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or however long it takes, things are going to change, and your operating model is probably going to need to be modified as well. So it's definitely, there's a lot of art to that. There's science to the operating model part of it, but the art of figuring out how do we get there, and what are the different steps, and what's that strategy, therein lies the art. And a lot of that comes down to, your culture, your risk tolerance, and your ability to change. There's a lot of things that factor into that we assess to help clients figure that out.
Interesting. And I mean, talking about timelines, you mentioned in your conversation with Wayne, I think it was a client that you had that was able to execute their transformation in 12 months. So in 1 year, which sounds like that's kind of quick. And when they were asked, how did you do it? They said they spent over half the time in the planning phase. So 60% of the whole project was planning, laying down the groundwork for this operating model, for their processes, etc. So I guess, what is the average transformation time? I mean, it obviously depends on the size of the company and number of employees and blah, blah, blah. But what would you say at a high level for this particular company that you were talking about, for example, what's the average timeline?
Yeah, so that's another. Maybe I'll throw in a caveat here before I answer that. There's sort of what is the actual average, and then what should the average be, and those aren't necessarily the same thing. When you look at research we've done over the years, for over 10 years now, we've been doing annual surveys and studies of actual implementation results for organizations throughout the world. Not just our clients. We're actually intentionally looking outside of our client base to get a better feel for, what's the market doing in general. And when we've studied that metric as far as how long a project takes, the average has hovered between 16 and 18 months. But that's an average for companies of all sizes, all different industries, geographies, et cetera. So you have to normalize it for who you are. For example, we have some clients that have implemented in 3 to 6 months. We have other clients that, like I mentioned, that have taken 6 to 7 years. So there's a huge variation there, but the average, the unweighted average in the market tends to fall between 16 and 18 months.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot that goes into it, from the planning side to making sure your team receives the new change correctly. There's a lot that goes into it. And I know that, the conversation of how long it takes to implement an ERP system or any system, it like you said, it ranges. And I'm excited to kind of run through the conversation you had with a handful of people on LinkedIn about, is it possible to do a transformation in 6 weeks?
Yeah, I'm highly skeptical of that concept. There's software vendors out there, especially when you're looking at the smaller organization. So a company that is on QuickBooks now, or some basic accounting software, and they're sort of going to their first ERP system, or just something more robust than what they have. Those organizations can certainly implement faster than, say, the big steel companies, examples that I mentioned. But 6 weeks is pretty aggressive when you think about all the things that need to happen, as far as process changes and just getting your people to change. Even if you could have the system fully designed and the processes perfectly designed and ready to go on day one, it's probably going to take you more than 6 weeks just to get your people to figure out, how to use it and get them on board with it, and fine tune it and just get it operational. But then obviously you add in the fact that you have to define your processes, you have to design and build the software, test it, all that stuff. It usually takes a lot longer. And there's companies out there like Oracle NetSuite, I think, is guilty of this, and a lot of other vendors are, that especially the ones that target the small companies. Oracle, for example, will come out and say, hey, we've got Suite Success. It's a sort of a methodology and a framework they use to fast track an implementation. And we see it a lot with our smaller clients, where they say, hey, within 90 days, you'll be up and running with our entire suite of products. And the problem is that technically they're right. You could flip a switch and you could probably have it up faster than 90 days. You could probably spend a weekend or maybe just a few days, getting it up and running. The problem is there's just so many decisions you have to make about how you want to configure it, what you want your process flow to look like, how are you going to move the data over, how are you going to test it, make sure it works with your business, how are you going to get your people adapted. You add up all that stuff and suddenly you're looking at a lot more than 6 weeks or 90 days or whatever. I don't want to say it can't be done, but it's highly unusual to have an implementation that takes less than 90 days. And for the ones that do, oftentimes it's sort of like a good news, bad news situation. Like, good news, congratulations, you implemented in less than 90 days. But the bad news is now your operations are a mess and you can't ship product and you've got consequences to deal with on the other side of go live. So you have to straddle that too. You have to figure out, how much is this really going to take us and how much is it really going to cost us, not just in the initial 6 weeks, 90 days or whatever, 18 months, 6 years, whatever the duration is. You also have to look at what are we doing to our operations and what's that ROI after the fact. And sometimes you find that, you'll end up with a negative ROI simply based on the fact that you lost a bunch of customer orders, or customers are irritated and ticked off at you because you can't ship product. How much does that cost? You have to look at that as well.
Yeah, opportunity costs for sure. That's interesting. Do you want me to dive into your LinkedIn posts right now? Should we cut to a quick break?
Sure. Yeah, let's go to a break, and then we'll be right back in this last segment. You can dig into the post, and we'll take some more audience or social media type engagement. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Paresa Noble, and we were just talking about operating models, which we've been talking about for a while now, and this whole segment or this whole episode is largely devoted to operating models, business process improvement, all that good stuff. And before the break, you were starting to dive into some social media engagement and conversations that were happening related to this topic of operating models, but also we were starting to get into implementation durations as well. How long does it take? Should it take? All that good stuff. So what do you see in there on social media?
That's right. Well, I mean, we touched on the concept of, is it possible to do this in 6 weeks? And you posed that question to people on LinkedIn as well. And it was interesting to see the responses. So just to position the question that you asked, here's the scenario. You have a software vendor who we'll call ABC. They tell the prospect that they can implement their solution in 6 weeks for $150,000 USD. Can it be done? Is it possible? What's your opinion? And we had a handful of different responses. So I wanted to run through a few that stood out to me. One was from Tanya Franklin, and she's saying it's possible. I think she was one of the only ones that went against the grain and said it might be possible. So good for you, Tanya. I think that, her position is it depends on the type of system. You can't do a full on ERP implementation. It must be a project with a smaller scope. That was her, kind of end line with it. But her thought is if you have strong resources, from, your partners, your vendor, your executive leadership, if you have a carefully developed project plan and, an operating model like we were just talking about, it can be done. So that's one perspective of it. Another is, it depends on the industry and the product, because certain products will need more customization. And let's see, it can be deployed with standard packs within 2 to 3 weeks, depending on, what product. That's Ali Arsalan said that. And then we had Ashfaq say, not possible if you're going for ideal results. He just started with Oracle Financials Cloud, and it's an ocean. I love that metaphor. I imagine it's an ocean. There's so much to do there just on the system side. And then, like you were saying, Eric, you add in kind of the data migration, the organizational change management component. There's so much that goes into it. So we had some mixed reviews, and it's interesting to see, you either choose, do you want it to be done right, or do you want it to be done quickly, is what it seems like.
Yeah, and most executives, I think, would probably say both. We want it done right, and we want it done quickly. But you do have to decide. It's sort of like the in project management. One of the schools of thought in project management is that you have speed, cost, and quality, and you can only have 2 of those 3. You can't have all 3 of those. You can't go fast, high quality, and low cost. You can only have 2 of the 3. So it's sort of the same thing here. You have to prioritize and figure out what's more important. If you're a high growth company that is moving quickly, then maybe speed is more important. So once you prioritize and you figure out what those priorities are and what your most important factors are, then you have a more realistic view of what that's going to look like.
Interesting. Well, I thought we could finish this episode off with a fun game that kind of ties into this. So I'm gonna, describe a company type, and I want to name off different like best of breed systems, like a CRM, SCM, etc. And then you tell us what is the timeline or average timeline that people should be shooting for. Okay, so for this game, let's think of a company that is in high growth. They're in high growth phase. They're growing super fast. It's a fulfillment company that is shipping products to customers worldwide. So they have a warehouse. They also help manufacture products. So they have supply chain situation. They, sell to B2B businesses. So they need help with sales too. So it's kind of a full scope company that could really utilize any of these systems. So are you ready, Eric?
I'm ready. I didn't know this was a game, but it feels like a lot of pressure. Is there money at stake? Could I win or lose money based on my responses here?
I think you're good. We'll keep the money out of it. Keep it
Okay.
safe. Maybe next time.
Okay.
Okay, so if this company wanted to implement a CRM, how long on average would it and should it take?
Okay, so before, and those that know me know that I overthink things and I'm very analytical. So before I answer, I have to give a disclaimer that do not quote me on this. And if you're listening and you fit that exact profile that Paresa just described and you're ready to write down my answer and that's going to be the duration you're banking your career on, do not do that. That's a terrible idea. But I'll give you an answer based on limited information. So assuming they've selected a CRM system, and let's just say they pick Salesforce or whatever it is, and they already know what the CRM is. And do we know how many employees they have? Did you say that? Or
Let's say they have 100 employees.
Okay, so maybe they have, let's just say they have like 20 salespeople, 15, 20 salespeople-ish. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, sure. That sounds good.
Then I would say this probably is a case where you could deploy in less than 90 days if you knew the software, if you had, especially if you already have a clear vision of what you want your sales processes and your customer service processes to look like. I would say absolutely you could do that in 90 days. If you don't have your processes defined, and if you're very disparate right now, and this is going to be a massive change for you as an organization, I'd say it's probably going to take you more than 90 days. And the other assumption I'm drawing here, maybe just assuming, is that there are, as a high growth company, you typically have limited resources internally. So your people are probably going to get distracted with day-to-day stuff while you're trying to roll out this new CRM system. So that's going to slow you down. Again, I'm not talking about just technically, can you turn on the system in X amount of time? I'm talking about how long till you're actually using it. So I'd say all those things probably push you to, I'd say 5 to 6 months, on average. But the exception being if you had those other caveats in place, like you had a clear vision of what you want, and this isn't a huge change for your organization, you could probably do it in less than 3 months.
Interesting. See, process planning, it just makes all the difference, it sounds like. Okay,
Yep.
How about a supply chain management system?
Supply chain management. So that's more complicated because you're touching more processes and you're inherently having to touch things outside of supply chain. So now you're touching your customer orders, your sales team, your financials. Everything sort of ties back to that supply chain management. So I'm going to assume that you're talking about implementing a supply chain management system that also needs to integrate to your financials, maybe to your CRM, your inventory management, whatever the case may be. I'd say in this case, I would say probably if you weren't doing the CRM project at the same time, so let's assume that this is a standalone, we're just doing supply chain management right now. I would say at least 6 to 9 months.
Interesting.
Yeah,
That
probably more. But you run it right. You do. You have a solid strategy. You have the technology picked. You have the plan up front to do the operating model and to get a solid plan and governance in place. I'd say you could probably do it in 6 to 9 months for that size of organization. If you're a larger organization with multinational and multiple warehouses, multiple locations, that number could go up to a couple years if it's a larger organization or a larger supply chain.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, supply chain is way more complex than a sales process, I would imagine. So that makes sense. What about a warehouse management software?
So warehouse management, it's a little bit more isolated, I guess, in some ways. You're dealing with inventory management, which spans, the supply chain and other parts of the business as well. But it's largely confined to, pick, packing, shipping within a warehouse. So you're sort of, isolating the change, isolating the impact, relatively speaking. Obviously, if you mess up your inventory or your warehouse can't ship, obviously that affects a lot of people and can have a lot of negative implications. But in general, it's a little bit more isolated. So I'd say longer than it would take to implement CRM, but not as long as it would take to implement supply chain management. So I'd put it at somewhere around, let's say 5 to 6 months.
Okay. Got it. Okay, let's look at the HR side of things. How about a human capital management system?
Yeah, those actually, I think, are the hardest to predict, because on one hand you think it's just HCM, it's just HR. We only have, say, 5, in this example, maybe they have 5 HR people or whatever the number might be. With 100 employees, I can't imagine they have more than 5 or 10 HR people, probably less. So you think, okay, that's not that many people, so it's not going to be that hard to change. Well, you're actually impacting all of your employees. That's the one technology where everyone's going to be impacted, because now you're talking about performance management, performance reviews, hiring and firing, recruiting, all that stuff. The whole hire to retire process is affected by human capital management and HR systems. So you're affecting everyone, which amplifies or bumps up the duration and the effort it takes. I'd say it's probably, even for this size of an organization, it's, if you want to do it right and you don't want to have a ton of disruption with your HR processes, which you could do. I mean, if you are going to pick an area where you're okay with the disruption, I suppose HR might be an okay one to pick. I wouldn't recommend it, but if you had to pick one, just because, most organizations can deal with someone not being able to fill out their benefits paperwork in the way they want them to, but they can deal with that a lot easier than they can deal with not being able to ship product or not being able to close the books or run a report of what their P&L is or whatever. So I'd say, you can probably take a little more risk with HR systems, and I apologize to HR professionals out there who totally disagree with me, and I'm sure some of you do. But, that realistically speaking, that's what we found. So I'd say you might be able to do it in more like the CRM range, like a 3 to 6 month window. I'd suggest more like 6 months if you want to minimize disruption. But if you wanted to take a risk and say, hey, we'll take our chances just in the name of getting something up and running faster, you could probably do it closer to 3.
Okay. Interesting. All right. What if they wanted to do a full-on digital facelift and get an ERP system to just run everything for them, from their supply chain all the way to accounting, invoicing, etc.?
So I'd put them pretty close to that average across the board that we talked about before, that 16 to 18 months, maybe a little bit lower, assuming they do things right. And that's the other thing you have to be careful of with benchmarks, is even though I have this benchmark that I share, which is 16 to 18 months as the average, that's the average of what actually happens, not what should happen or what could happen if you do things right. So if you really look at, leveraging implementation best practices and leading with the business, not the technology, investing in change management, all the stuff that we talk about in this podcast and YouTube videos and all the stuff we put out there and all the advice we typically give to our clients, if you do all those things, you could probably do it in closer to a year. But you have to do those things right. If you don't do those things right, it's probably going to take more like 16 to 18 months, maybe longer if you really screw things up. So a lot of it depends on how you plan and how you execute.
Right. Yep. It just goes back to summarize, excuse me, everything we talked about is laying the foundation brick by brick, planning it out, mapping it out, and that's what's going to help you transform your business in way less time than you would if you didn't. So makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key to your questions there, the key way to think about for people listening of what about my business? My business is X number of employees, X number of locations and countries and all that stuff. Hopefully that way of thinking, me trying to think out loud, will demonstrates how you should think about how you're going to define your timeline. And keep in mind too, you're going to get a proposal from your software vendor or vendors that are probably overly optimistic and incomplete. So you need to translate what they give you into reality. And I've kind of verbalized how you translate some of that into reality based on how you run the project and some of the different assumptions that go into these sorts of transformations. Right.
Fascinating stuff, I gotta say.
Yeah. So thanks for that speed round. I'm glad I didn't lose money on that, because I hate gambling. So unless I win, then of course I love it. But Generally, I don't gamble, so that was fun. So thanks for another good episode, Paresa. Good to have you back, and we'll look forward to our next episode next week.
Sounds great. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and you're listening to Transformation Ground Control. Be sure to subscribe, share this video, or share this recording or the audio format with friends and colleagues. We'd love to get the word out, and certainly drop us a review too. Give us a thumbs up and or a review on the podcast platform that you're listening or watching this on. And in the meantime, we will see you all next week. Have a good day.